Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. I'm standing in the side yard. We are at the entrance to my shade garden here. It is mid-May and it is a cool, drizzly day. The song sparrows are singing, one of my favorite birds. Sometimes I lament not being in the Midwest, mostly for the migratory songbirds, because the Pacific Northwest has so many fewer species, but the ones that we do have I really cherish. So I'm standing here at the entrance to my shade garden because I wanted to talk about something that I saw in a kind of regenerative living, like sustainable ag type group, where someone commented that permaculture is just escapism. It's not practical, it's not useful, and it is just kind of a pastoral fantasy, a cottagecore dream, if you will. And I thought I would address that issue as somebody who's been practicing permaculture for over 20 years and somebody who has been living in a permaculture dream garden for the last 14 that I have spent, pretty much every spare second of my time creating. So, is permaculture some kind of idyllic notion? Is it an efficacious system for pushing humanity towards sustainability? I would argue absolutely it is. I think that we have done permaculture a disservice, kind of glamorizing it as this beautiful back to Eden kind of notion, this lush paradise. For me, my garden is a paradise. It is somewhere that I would rather be. I have mentioned before that, we are a large family and we live on a tight budget, and travel is not really something that we engage in particularly much. And I have always worked toward making my home a place that I don't need a vacation from. A place that I love being. I love spending my time here. I'm quite a homebody as much as I do actually love travel. And I want to make my home a place that is nurturing, not only for my body in terms of the harvests that I get out of the garden, but is also nurturing for my soul. So in that way, it can perhaps feel that permaculture is this kind of lush garden paradise. And it can be, but that is not actually what permaculture really is. Permaculture is not just a naturalistic way of gardening. It is not just a way of gardening that is aesthetically pleasing and perhaps kind of wild and rambly, and again, that kind of fantasy notion of what a garden should be. It's not some landscape backdrop out of a gorgeous anime. It is real life. It takes a lot of work, as I've talked about in the past. But permaculture is not just a garden. Permaculture is a design system. It is a way of approaching the organization of our living spaces, of our food growing spaces, of our community spaces, of our businesses, of our whole society. It's a way of organizing those spaces to reduce harm toward other people, harm toward the planet, and to actually go even further than harm reduction, but go toward regeneration. So it is a way of designing the interaction between people, but that's called social permaculture. The way that we have systems of supporting each other and communicating with each other, all the way down to our interpersonal relationships. That's all social permaculture. It is seeing the connectedness in all things, in all relationships, in all communication, and striving to make those systems of communication and interpersonal relationships not only productive but resilient. Because if we have toxic ways of relating to each other, we cannot possibly work together towards sustainability. So there's social permaculture. There is designing our actual physical structures, the ways that we design our communities and our roads and our infrastructure to be sustainable. currently right now, most homes in North America are not set up for passive solar design. They're not set up to recycle wastes within the system and create a closed system. They're designed to fit a certain aesthetic and usually cheaply built in a way that benefits a developer, but not particularly the homeowner or the community in terms of resource conservation and in terms of green living. So we end up with homes that are perhaps beautiful, but expensive to maintain and resource heavy use. So permaculture would have us design our buildings, our homes, our streets, our community centers, our hospitals in a way that efficiently uses resources and has intelligent, effectual design. But even more than that, it would think about organizing the way that we put those buildings in the landscape and in our cities, design those for peak efficiency, which we don't currently do. Obviously, this is kind of a radical notion. It would take redesigning or retrofitting. If you haven't read the book, Retrofit Suburbia, you should read it. Retrofitting our communities for sustainability. And thinking about how we're not just looking at gardens as a way to produce food, and we're not just thinking about stacking in plants to optimize our productivity in the garden, but we're thinking about stacking in our functions, in our human spaces, in our dwellings, in our business spaces to maximize efficiency and reduce harm. Permaculture is a very complicated thing when you start to look at all of the layers of it, how it can be. I think a good introduction for permaculture can be to look at gardening, to look at abandoning the extractive methods of agriculture that we have historically used for the last 100 years or so, and think about designing in a way that is smarter, more complicated, more resilient, more productive. And so when we begin to approach permaculture from the garden first, we are getting people to chuck the traditional notions of kind of carbon heavy, inorganic fertilizer heavy, extractive, erosion heavy methods, petroleum heavy methods of agriculture. We're asking them to chuck those out the window and try and start with a fresh canvas and rethink the way that we grow food. Start with an entirely new premise. Start with the premise of we want to care for the earth, care for people, and share the surplus. And so how do we design systems that do that effectively? Starting with the garden is a great introduction. From there, I tend to encourage people to think about what they can do inside their home to follow the 12 principles of permaculture and see that those principles are applicable not only in the garden, but in the home. Once you see that your garden is an extension of your home, you can start to see that your community, your neighborhood is an extension of your home. So how do we apply permaculture design principles to our communities? From there, how do we apply them to our places of employment? How do we employ them to our infrastructure? How do we apply them to our government? How do we apply them to business models? Obviously, you've heard me kind of rail against the exploitive business models that are so prevalent in American society. Oh, there are so many bumblebees right now. I'm just a little distracted by them. We have a system that is set up for exploitation where a few at the top profit by harming workers and harming the planet. That's not permaculture. So how do we completely redesign our way of doing business? If we look at how we run our households, how we run our businesses, how we run our community spaces, those are filled with people. So then we have to think about redesigning the way we communicate with people so that we reduce harm. That's people care. How we communicate effectively in order to see our plans enacted without conflict, or there will inevitably be conflict. So how do we resolve it in a healthy way? Permaculture addresses all of these things. And even more than that, it is site-specific, culture-specific, community-specific. It should work within a specific climate, within a specific culture, within specific locations. And that's really, really important. We need permaculture to be tailored, not only to our backyards, but also to our communities, because every community looks different, every culture looks different, every individual is different as all of our gardens are. So am I getting any closer to the answering the question of, is permaculture kind of an idyllic notion and a pipe dream, or is it reality? Well, it's certainly not gardening. And I think that the aspect of it that is gardening, when people say that's not attainable, well, you can look around my garden and many of the other highly effective permaculture gardens and realize that they are absolutely attainable. They take work, and they take smart design, and they take rethinking things and doing things differently. The same is true for our whole culture. The whole way that we organize human systems and relate to the environment needs to be reworked. Just like I took this garden that was sod and weeds and I reworked it into something that is highly productive and that nourishes my soul and my body and my family as well. The same way we need to remake our social systems so that they are nourishing to humans and regenerative to the planet. The same way that we can benefit from redoing our gardens, we can benefit from redoing our community infrastructure and our buildings that we reside in and work in. And I realized that if we want to make those effective permaculture changes, it requires us pushing back an extractive system where the folks with power are profiting off of their extraction, and they don't want to give that up very willingly. They don't want to create a resilient way of living because that's a way in which the planet is cared for and people are cared for. And when folks are profiting off of harming people in the planet, then they have very little motivation to want to change. But all of us can work together to shift the narrative. We're going to have to. Our planet needs it. Our communities need it. Not only the way that we are harming the planet, but the way that popular culture is in many ways degraded and we are harming each other. Our discourse is degraded. We all can do better and design better. And I think permaculture can answer a lot of those lingering questions about how we do that. Because the 12 principles of permaculture, I have lots of videos on those. And the 3 ethics of permaculture are things that guide us toward truly resilient and sustainable design. They are the framework through which we can start to ask new questions and design for truly effective solutions. So is permaculture idyllic? In some ways, yes, but it's also something that has to work and can work in the real world. Just like it's worked in my garden, we can expand beyond that if we take the time, we take the effort, and we invest in ourselves, in our planet, in our communities. Thanks.